It's November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. The sun is shining, the weather is beautiful, and the people of Lisbon are doing what good Catholics do on a holy day. They're in church. Every single major church in the city is packed. The faithful are kneeling, praying, singing hymns. It's peaceful. It's sacred. It's about to become a nightmare. Because at exactly 9:30 in the morning, the ground beneath them decided it had heard enough praying. It started with a gentle tremble, like someone was shaking a rug. Then came the roar, a deep, terrifying noise from underground that made people think the devil himself was rising from hell. Then the real shaking began. For 6 to 7 minutes, which felt like an eternity, Lisbon swayed like corn in the wind, as buildings collapsed like houses of cards. Churches crumbled on top of worshippers, homes fell on families. A massive cloud of dust rose over the city, blotting out the sun. And then the earth stopped shaking. But the nightmare was just getting started. So what made this earthquake special? Well, for starters, it was a doozy. Modern seismologists estimate it was around 8.7 on the Richter scale. That's bigger than the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Bigger than the one that destroyed Tokyo in 1923. We're talking about a holy crap level of shaking. The epicenter was about 200 kilometers southwest of Lisbon, out in the Atlantic Ocean, which meant the energy traveled through the earth and hit the city with almost no warning. Within the first 10 minutes, 3 major shocks hit. The first 2 were the primary and secondary waves, the P waves and S waves that seismologists talk about. But that third one? That's the mystery. Scientists still argue about it, but here's the part that makes this disaster truly terrifying. About 45 minutes after the shaking stopped, people who had survived the collapse of their churches and homes made their way down to the Tagus River. They wanted to escape by boat. They thought they were safe. Then the water started to recede, and people who knew the sea knew what that meant. The water rose like a mountain. A wall of water, foaming and roaring, surged up the river. It smashed ships against each other and against the sea walls. Thousands who had made it to the waterfront were swept away. But wait, there's more. Because if the earthquake and tsunami weren't bad enough, the fire was just getting started. Candles, stoves, oil lamps, they all fell over during the shaking. The city was basically a tinderbox. Fires broke out everywhere and burned for 6 days. 6 days. And they completed the destruction of Europe's 4th largest city. By the time it was over, 60,000 people were dead in Lisbon alone. Some estimates say as many as 200,000 across the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. 85% of Lisbon's buildings were destroyed. One of the most vivid accounts comes from Reverend Charles Davy, an Englishman who survived the quake. He described the third shock as completing the ruin of those buildings which had already been much shattered. He watched the tsunami come in and ran for his life. Imagine being there, watching your world literally crumble around you, watching the water rise like a mountain, watching fire consume everything that the earthquake and tsunami left behind. That was Lisbon, November 1st, 1755. Now, here's where things get interesting. Because if you were a religious leader in 1755, you had a problem. A big one. The earthquake struck on All Saints' Day, one of the holiest days of the Catholic calendar. It destroyed almost every major church in the city. The churches didn't just suffer damage, they collapsed on top of the faithful. So the obvious question was, why would God do this? The church's answer was pretty straightforward. This is God's punishment for sin. The people of Lisbon had been evil, and God was smiting them. One priest, Father Gabriel Malagrida, a Jesuit missionary who had been influential in Portuguese territories, was particularly vocal about this. He preached that the earthquake was divine retribution. He said, and I quote, "What a great harvest of sinful souls such disasters send to hell." He insisted it was scandalous to pretend the earthquake was just a natural event. It was necessary, he said, to devote all our strength and purpose to the task of repentance. And he wasn't the only one saying this. There was a long tradition of interpreting natural disasters as acts of God. The Reformation was still fresh in people's minds, and Europe was deeply religious. But here's the thing. The church's explanation didn't quite fit. Because this earthquake didn't just destroy the sinful parts of Lisbon. It destroyed the churches. It destroyed the convents. It destroyed the faithful. If God was punishing sinners, why were the people kneeling in prayer the ones who got crushed? And even more awkwardly, why did the red light districts survive relatively intact? This is where the Enlightenment enters the picture. Because if there's one thing philosophers hate, it's a contradiction they can't explain. Enter Voltaire, Voltaire was already one of the most famous philosophers in Europe. He was a deist. He believed in God, but not in the church's version of God. He was a critic of organized religion, of superstition, and of what he saw as the optimism of his intellectual rivals. And when he heard about Lisbon, he was horrified, but he was also confused. Because how could a benevolent, all-powerful God allow this to happen? How could a just God destroy the faithful in their own churches? How could a merciful God drown thousands of people in a tsunami? Voltaire wrote a poem about it. It's called Poème sur le désastre de Lisbonne, Poem on the Lisbon Disaster. And it is not a happy poem. The first few lines go something like this. Unhappy mortals, dark and mourning earth, affrigrated gathering of humankind, eternal lingering of useless pain. Come, ye philosophers, who cry, all's well, and contemplate this ruin of a world. It's basically the 18th century version of a what the hell God tweet. Just longer. And in French. But Voltaire's critique wasn't just a rant. It was a philosophical argument against something called optimism. Now, let's talk about optimism. Not the kind where you think you'll get a promotion. This was a philosophical theory. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German philosopher, had argued in his book Theodicy that this is the best of all possible worlds. God, being perfect, had created the best possible world. Everything that happened, even bad things, was part of a greater good that we couldn't understand. It was a pretty popular idea. It offered comfort. Yes, bad things happen, but God knows what he's doing. There's a reason. We just can't see it. Think about how comforting that sounds. Everything happens for a reason. That's basically what Leibniz was selling. But Voltaire looked at Lisbon and said, "Really? This is the best possible world? This is God's plan? What kind of plan involves 60,000 people dying in their own churches? What kind of God thinks this is best?" He wrote a satire about it. It's called Candide. It's one of the most famous satirical works ever written. The main character, Candide, travels the world with his philosophy teacher, Dr. Pangloss. And Pangloss keeps insisting that this is the best of all possible worlds. No matter how horrible things get, Pangloss repeats his mantra. And the world is horrible. There's war, disease, slavery, disaster. The characters suffer constantly. When Candide arrives in Lisbon just in time for the earthquake, he says, "If this is the best of all possible worlds, what are the others?" Brilliant. But here's what makes Voltaire even more interesting. He didn't become an atheist. He remained a deist. He believed in God, but he came to doubt God's goodness, and that was a radical shift. If God is all-powerful but not all good, then what does that mean for religion? If God allows this suffering, maybe we shouldn't rely on him. Maybe we should rely on ourselves. But Voltaire wasn't the only philosopher thinking about this. Another guy had a very different take. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was younger than Voltaire, more radical, and he had a different answer to the problem of evil. Rousseau basically said, the earthquake is not God's fault, it's ours. Wait, what? His argument went like this. Yes, the earthquake is a natural event. Earthquakes happen, but the suffering, the death toll, the disaster, that's not God's doing. That's human beings being stupid. He pointed out that the earthquake could have been much less destructive if the city had been better designed. If the buildings were lower, if the streets were wider, if people had evacuated properly. Much of the evil that exists in the world is actually man-made, he argued. He suggested that proper urban planning would have greatly diminished the death toll. So his conclusion was very different from Voltaire's. Voltaire said, God might be evil or indifferent. Rousseau said, stop blaming God, start fixing your cities. This was a huge shift in thinking. It moved the problem from, why does God allow this, to, what can humans do about it? It shifted the responsibility from the divine to the human, and this was the seed of modern disaster management, of urban planning, of the idea that we can prevent suffering, even if we can't prevent earthquakes. And then there was Immanuel Kant. Yes, that Kant. The guy who wrote Critique of Pure Reason. The guy whose philosophy is so dense that reading him feels like trying to run through a swimming pool filled with molasses. Well, Kant got interested in the earthquake too. And you know what he did? He didn't write a poem. He didn't write a satire. He wrote 3 scientific essays about the earthquake. 3. Kant studied the causes of earthquakes. He researched the scientific reasons for tremors. He wanted to understand why earthquakes happen, not just philosophize about them. And this is significant, because Kant basically set the path for the modern study of seismology. He wasn't asking, why did God allow this? He was asking, how did this happen? And what can we learn from it? This is the scientific revolution in action. A shift from asking why to asking how. From divine explanations to natural explanations. And this is the real legacy of the Lisbon earthquake. Now, let's talk about the guy who did something practical. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later known as the Marquis of Pombal. He was Portugal's foreign affairs minister, and after the earthquake he became the effective ruler of the country. When the king, King José I, was so traumatized that he couldn't even make basic decisions, Pombal stepped up. The king cowered in the royal retreat of Belém, which was relatively unscathed. He asked Pombal what to do. "What is to be done to meet this infliction of divine justice?" the king asked, trembling. Pombal, being a practical guy, gave one of the most iconic answers in the history of disasters. He said, "Bury the dead and feed the living." Is that apocryphal? Probably. But it's so perfect that historians repeat it anyway. Pombal didn't have time for theological debates. He had a city to rebuild. He had survivors to feed. He had looters to hang, which he did, summarily. He organized the recovery effort with a ruthlessness that would make a modern disaster manager blush. He dispatched troops to fight the fires, search the ruins for survivors, and execute anyone caught stealing. He ordered all able-bodied men to be rounded up and forced to clear debris and build temporary shelters. He banned any permanent construction until a proper plan could be drawn up. And that plan was radical. He chose the most extreme option, raze the entire city center and rebuild it from scratch. The new Lisbon had wide streets, strict building standards, a sewage system, and proper drainage. It was designed with earthquake resistance in mind. Before any building was constructed, a model was built and tested by having troops march around it to simulate earthquake shaking. 20 years later, it was done. But Pombal didn't stop there. He saw the opportunity to modernize the country. He expelled the Jesuits, which was a huge deal since they were one of the most powerful institutions in the country. He reformed schools and government administration. He eased censorship. He outlawed slavery in Portugal. He was a dictator, basically. He ruled with an iron fist, but he also dragged Portugal, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. Now let's get to the big philosophical punchline. The Lisbon earthquake is often credited with, or blamed for, the birth of modern atheism, evil. Why? Because of the problem of evil. Here's the argument. If God is good, and God is all-powerful, why does he allow suffering? This is an old question. But the Lisbon earthquake put it front and center in a way that couldn't be ignored. 60,000 people died. In their own churches. On a holy day. How could a good God allow that? How could a just God allow that? How could a loving God allow that? Cardinal Kurt Koch, a modern Swiss cardinal, put it this way. The Lisbon earthquake radically called into question many certainties that had previously existed. From a religious point of view, doubts arose about the goodness of God and his omnipotence. He went on, the terrible suffering and death of so many people began a much greater questioning of the existence of God than all enlightened philosophical theories and epistemological treatises. The famous expression of suffering as the rock of atheism remains inextricably linked to Lisbon. That's a direct quote from a cardinal. A Catholic cardinal saying that the earthquake was more influential in creating atheism than any philosophical argument. That's huge, and you can see why. Philosophy is abstract. But watching your wife die under a collapsing church? Watching your children drown in a tsunami? That's not abstract. That's concrete. That's personal. So the Lisbon earthquake is considered one of the main contributors to atheism as an outlook on life. It didn't make everyone atheists overnight, but it planted seeds. It created doubt. It made people ask questions that the church couldn't answer. Now, I need to tell you a side story that's both bizarre and tragic. Remember Father Gabriel Malagrida, the Jesuit priest who was all, God is punishing sinners? Well, he didn't just get the theology wrong, he got the politics wrong too. The Marquis of Pombal was running the country, and he didn't have patience for priests who were stirring up panic. Pombal needed people to rebuild, not to repent, and Malagrida just wouldn't shut up about divine punishment. He kept preaching. He kept insisting that the earthquake was a sign of God's wrath. He became a thorn in Pombal's side. And then things took a dark turn. In 1758, there was an attempt on the king's life. Some nobles were implicated. And, wait for it, Malagrida got caught up in the investigation. Pombal used this as an excuse to crack down. He prosecuted and executed some of Portugal's most reactionary nobles. He expelled the Jesuits from the entire country. And he had Malagrida executed by the Portuguese Inquisition. Yes, you heard that right. The same Inquisition that had burned people at the stake for heresy was used by Pombal to execute a Jesuit priest. The irony is staggering. The priest who preached divine punishment ended up being punished by the state. But what's most revealing is this. Cardinal Manuel Clemente, Patriarch Emeritus of Lisbon, has read all the parish reports from the earthquake. He says that in none of them did he find any portrayal of the earthquake as divine retribution. Not a single one. Malagrida was an exception. He was influential because he had connections, but by that time, he was also considered to be suffering from dementia. So the popular narrative that the church universally declared the earthquake a punishment from God, that's kind of a myth. Some priests said it, but many didn't. Most of the church's official documents from the time don't make that argument. This shows that the debate wasn't just between the church and the Enlightenment, it was also within the church itself. So, why was this particular earthquake so influential? Natural disasters happen all the time. There were earthquakes before 1755. There were floods, plagues, famines. Why did this one change European thinking? Cardinal Clemente gave a brilliant analogy. He said it was the 9/11 of the 18th century. Think about how 9/11 changed the modern world. It shattered the optimism of the 1990s. It made people feel vulnerable. It led to wars, surveillance, and a permanent sense of fear. It challenged the belief that the world was becoming safer and more peaceful. The Lisbon earthquake did the same thing for the 18th century. The first half of the 18th century was a time of optimism in Europe. Science was advancing, knowledge was spreading, people were discovering new continents, new cultures, new ideas. The Enlightenment was promising a bright future, a world governed by reason, justice, and progress. And then this earthquake happened, and it destroyed everything, literally and metaphorically. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a philosophical crisis. It challenged everything the Enlightenment believed about the world. If this was the best of all possible worlds, what hope was there? The earthquake forced people to confront the reality of evil and suffering. It made people realize that the world is chaotic, unpredictable, and indifferent. That reason has limits. It started a sustained discourse on catastrophe that influenced philosophy, literature, and art for generations. And in a weird way, it made the Enlightenment stronger. Because the Enlightenment was about facing reality. It was about questioning authority. It was about using reason to find truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. The Lisbon earthquake didn't just change philosophy. It changed science too. It gave birth to seismology, the study of earthquakes. Pombal's survey was the first systematic attempt to study earthquakes scientifically. He sent a questionnaire to parishes across the country. The questions included, how many aftershocks were felt? What kind of damage was caused? How long did the earthquake last? Did the shaking come from one direction? What happened to the wells and water? This was an earthquake fact-finding mission, 18th century style. These questionnaires provided data that modern seismologists have used to construct maps of the shaking intensity. They helped scientists understand that the earthquake was centered near the Algarve coast. Not exactly, but close. Pombal also ordered new building practices to be put in place. Lisbon became one of the first cities in the world to have earthquake-resistant buildings. They tested models by having soldiers march around them to simulate shaking. This was the beginning of earthquake engineering. So when you see modern buildings designed to survive earthquakes, you can thank Lisbon 1755. So, after all of this, what have we learned? We've learned that the Lisbon earthquake wasn't just a natural disaster, it was an intellectual earthquake. It shattered the idea that the world is governed by a benevolent God. It challenged the optimism of the Enlightenment. It sparked debates about the problem of evil. It gave birth to seismology. It led to modern urban planning. It made people question authority, religious and political. Voltaire used it to attack blind faith. Rousseau used it to advocate for human responsibility. Kant used it to advance science. Pombal used it to modernize Portugal. And all of them, in their own way, were saying the same thing. Stop looking to heaven for answers. Start looking to each other. Because the earthquake didn't kill 60,000 people just because the ground shook. It killed 60,000 people because Lisbon was poorly built, poorly planned, and poorly managed. The earthquake was natural. The disaster was human. And that's the real lesson. We can't stop earthquakes, but we can build better cities. We can respond better. We can plan better. We can prepare better. We can't stop natural disasters, but we can stop them from becoming catastrophes. The Lisbon earthquake was a tragedy, but it was also a wake-up call. And the world, slowly, began to wake up. The next time you see a building that's earthquake-resistant, remember Lisbon. The next time you hear someone ask, "Why does God allow suffering?" remember Voltaire. The next time you see a city that's well-planned, remember Pombal. And the next time you read a scientific study of earthquakes, remember that it all started with an earthquake that shook not just the ground, but the minds of a whole continent. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most influential disasters. If this story changed the way you see the world, please like, subscribe, and share. Because the more people know about the past, the better equipped we are to deal with the future. See you next time on the next historical journey.